Okay, so I'll introduce you to Greg, who's going to start by just going through some of the basics of acoustics, and hopefully you'll be much wiser for it by the time he finishes in about 20 minutes or so. So, and remember, any questions, put them in the chat room, and we'll do our best to answer throughout, but we'll also save some to ask Greg at the end, so you can ask during or after. Over to you, Greg.
Okay, thanks, Dave. So today we're just going to be, I'll just try and share a screen here, one moment. So today we're going to be looking at just an introduction to room acoustics. We're going to be just going through some of the most common sort of questions we get asked, look at sort of how sound travels in a room, how you can treat it, and hopefully we'll have a bit more knowledge by the end of it and have better sounding rooms. So topics we're going to cover, the most common one we get asked very often is soundproofing or acoustic treatment. We'll be looking at the difference of the two, what applications you'll use each one for, because they're quite different animals. We'll also be looking at how reflections affect your room, how to identify where your reflection points are, and ultimately how to treat them. After we've looked at that, we'll look at some acoustic and room variations. We'll touch on how a different shaped room or different sized room can affect the sound and the type of treatment you will ultimately need to use for it. The big question is, how much treatment do I need? The answer is probably lots if you call us, but we'll go through looking at what you need to treat specific things, and then we'll just take a look at a few things that are on the market, acoustic treatment, ready-made solutions, and some digital solutions, and weigh up the pros and cons to see what might work best for you in your space. So before we sort of dive into it, I just want to take a moment to explain briefly how waveforms work, because this will be a quite a common reoccurring theme when we talk about sound and acoustics. So you can see here on the screen that there are a low frequency waveform and a high frequency waveform. What waveforms are digital visualizations of what a sound wave is. And it has two axes, basically. There's a amplitude, which you can see on the vertical axis, or volume, and a rate or time. What this signifies is how long a frequency takes to develop over a set time period. And as you can see, a low frequency or base frequency is much larger, has less repetitions, and ultimately takes a lot longer to form, and is made up of much more energy, and unfortunately is a lot harder to treat in a room. By contrast, a high frequency waveform has multiple repetitions, and the more repetitions it has, the higher the frequency. The good news with that is there's less energy with higher frequency waveforms, and they're far easier to treat. So now that we understand roughly how we're looking at sound, let's take a look at some soundproofing. So the first question is, what does soundproofing do compared to acoustic treatment? And the answer is, it's designed to keep noise in or out. When I was growing up, my parents bought me a drum kit, and I'm sure that my neighbors would have loved me to be able to keep the sound in and out. Unfortunately, I couldn't afford soundproofing at the time, and I didn't know much about it, so they just had to, unfortunately, listen to me play very badly. But to achieve soundproofing, we're looking at two things, basically, absorption and decoupling. And the way we use these for is those high frequency waveforms we were speaking about earlier. They will be absorbed rather than decoupled, and that's done by having layers of porous materials, such as maybe a rock wool or a foam, something like that. And what this does is create a maze for the sound wave to essentially penetrate and get split up, and ultimately it redirects the sound energy into a different type of energy, like heat. Decoupling, on the other hand, is designed to essentially detach one surface from another to prevent vibrations from traveling through a surface and being amplified. If you may have put a mobile phone on vibrate on a table and noticed that the vibrations can be amplified through the table and into a audible noise, into a tone. The way we would decouple this surface or detach the phone from the table, if you put a pillow under the phone, for example, you would notice a significant drop in the vibrations transferring from the phone to the table, and it would essentially eliminate the vibrations before it can create a sound. So if we take a look at his mono booth here as an example of how all of these factors work together to create a soundproof booth, just go over to here to the next slide. You can see that it's made up of multi-layers of porous material. In this case, it's rock wool and plasterboard. And what this does is absorb the high frequencies. There's a perforated interior surface, which allows the waveforms to pass through to be absorbed by the materials. And there's a reflective outer surface, which will reflect and reflect any outer frequencies and reject them, and also reflect any internal frequencies back into the acoustic material to be absorbed before they can become a problem. Decoupling, as we sort of mentioned with the mobile phone, in an mono booth, or if you're soundproofing a space, you're going to want to use something like a floating floor, or in this case, as you can see on the screen, we're using a riser. Essentially, they're a board with very dense foam, and it's made up of lots of various thick materials. If you remember how the long waveform has a lot more energy for a low bass frequency and it's harder to treat, a floating floor with very dense materials will effectively absorb these frequencies at source before the vibrations are able to transfer through a surface or structure and create noise. A good example of this is if you've ever played on a stage, a hollow stage, and you've popped a bass amp or a guitar amp on the stage and it's just sounded extremely boomy. That's where the vibrations of the amp are traveling through the hollow stage. The hollow stage is amplifying these frequencies. If you were to pop an amp onto a riser, you would effectively decouple the amp from the stage, and you get a much tighter, cleaner sound, as we're only hearing the sound from the amp rather than from the structure itself. So here's a little animation for you to help sort of visualize how this all works together. So you can see here the reflective outer surface is rejecting any frequencies coming from outside the booth, and any that are able to penetrate the reflective surface are either going to be absorbed by the internal absorbed material, or it will be decoupled by the floors and walls not touching each other. So inside you won't hear, or you will hear very little of what this sound source is doing. And likewise from the inside, you will it will work much the same way. Outside the booth, you won't hear, in this case, the drum kit. The trick here, though, is mass. Really is the when you're looking at bass frequencies, you need to have mass. So the thicker the booth, the better performance absorbing lower frequencies. So now we understand a bit about how soundproofing works. Let's take a look at acoustic treatment and what it is and how we might want to use it. So with acoustic treatment, we're essentially trying to control the sound of the room for a better mixing or recording experience. If you say you have a studio set up and you've got a pair of monitors set in front of you, the direct sound will be coming from the speakers to your ears, but you'll also notice that there's sounds traveling from the speakers reflecting off walls and other surfaces and arriving at your ears at a slightly later time. If you leave these reflections untreated, it can really drastically affect your mix. How many of you have maybe recorded or mixed a track in your room and then taken it to the car, or maybe over to a friend's house, only to find it sounds completely different? This is likely because your room probably has no treatment or maybe even the wrong treatments in the wrong spots. So you really want to be able to treat these reflected frequencies before they can come back and mess with your mix position or your recording position. And we can do this by using absorbers or diffusers. You may have seen there's a whole host of things: foam panels, studio fiberglass panels like our studio panel, bass traps. All of these things can be used in conjunction with each other to absorb these reflections to create an even sound of the room. We're essentially trying to get the best mix of the direct sound coming from the speakers and the room sound, which is arriving at high ears a little bit later. So here's a little video to just help you visualize how this works. So here we can see the green arrows is our direct sound arriving at our mix position, and the purple arrows are bouncing off of the walls and ceilings and arriving back at the listening position at a slightly later rate. This is what's called an early reflection, which would be anything between 0 and 20 milliseconds. So in the case of an early reflection or any reflective reflection, a reflective surface is a reflection point, basically. If a sound can bounce off of it, be a wall, maybe your desk, a back wall, a window, these are all reflection points which can affect the sound of your room or your recording, and ultimately you will need to treat. The good news is early reflections, like we saw in the last video, are very easily treated because they're a high frequency waveform, which as we saw in an earlier slide, it's has less energy, it's made up of much more repetitions, and it's far easier to break up and treat. And the way to treat them is you can use what's called the mirror trick. And this is how you can find early reflection points and treat them rather than just dotting acoustic panels around your room, in place, taking a wild guess. It's better to be a bit more controlled in it. The way you implement the mirror trick is simple. You will need a assistant, and we have a video in a moment to show you. You'll need an assistant to sit in your mix position. And if you then take a little handheld mirror and run it across a side wall, as soon as your assistant who's in the chair can see the speaker or a speaker in a mix position in the mirror, that's a reflection point. You can mark it off and put up an acoustic panel there, and that's going to absorb that particular reflection point. So just to sort of help you see, here you can see our assistant is the green X sitting at the mix position, and on the left there you can see a mirror I'm running along the wall, and as soon as they can see a reflection point, I'm marking it off. You can see it's happening again on the right, and that's where I will treat those first two early reflection points. You will typically have 2 reflection points on your left and right per side. You should be able to see the left speaker first and then carry on the mirror along the wall, and you'd see the right speaker, and the same on the other side. Other early reflection points that are worth noting are the ceiling area above your mix position, the floor. If you have a wooden floor like in the slide here, you may want to put a carpet down or something like that, or a rug, and behind the speakers as well, as sound can travel backwards from the speakers if you have a rear ported speaker, or even just bounce around the corners and end up at the back. So you want to try and take care of those early reflections first. Basically what we're doing is treating these reflections that arrive in a few milliseconds later than the direct sound. And this is because when you get a reflected sound mixing with the direct sound, you get a phenomenon called comb filtering, which is essentially where the reflected sound and the direct sound doesn't line up with one another, and it can cause frequency cancellation. It can cause, so if effectively you could end up with no top end, or you may not be able to hear correctly all the frequencies that you're mixing. It will cause you to make poor mix decisions. you could end up with mixes with no top end, too much bass, too little bass. So it's important to treat these reflection points first. So here we are back in our studio, and I've carried out the mirror trick to identify my early reflection points. And you can see here now the direct sound in the green arrows is reaching our mix position, whilst the reflection points, which are the purple arrows, are being absorbed by our, in this case, we're using 25mm thick acoustic panels, but you could also use foam tiles or different thicknesses depending on what you're trying to achieve, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So once you've treated your early reflection points, you're going to want to look at the rest of the room. And typically you'll have to deal with the rear sides and the back wall. These can cause what's called late reflections or reverberations. Basically, it's the same as how we saw earlier with the early reflections, except it takes a lot longer for the reflected sound to travel from the speaker, bounce off the wall behind you and come back to your ears, which is why it will create a reverb or more ambient sort of sound, because it takes a longer round trip. So here we can see just how long reflections work. You can see it takes much more time for the reflected sound to travel to the reflection point and back to the mix position. So the way to treat these is two ways. We can use absorbers, which are similar to what we've used in our reflection points, and this will just stop the reflections dead if you want a particularly dry room. Or you can use a diffuser, and what a diffuser will do will scatter and disperse the reflections evenly and help create a ambience within the room. So an absorber will keep your room dry and very non-reflective, whereas a diffuser will scatter things up and create space within your room. And this works because here's an example of a diffuser. You can see it's got lots of ridges and peaks and bumps, and the way it works is it takes a sound source in and reflects it back out evenly into multiple mini waveforms. And what this does is tricks our brain into our brain can't comprehend this many frequencies all at once. That tricks our brain into hearing an ambience rather than a reflection. So these type of reflections are good reflections, as it just creates a space rather than messes with our mix position or our recording position. So here's our studio that we've been building, and you can see here I've installed the diffusers, and the direct sound is hitting our mix position, and the diffusers are doing their job, dispersing all of these frequencies and creating a bigger sounding room. This is useful for mixing. It may not be so useful for if you wanted to do voiceover work or something like that, where you want a particularly dry room. You would perhaps use the absorbers then, or a combination of the two. It really depends on how you want your room to sound. So once you've taken care of all of the high frequency waveforms and the high frequency reflections, you're going to want to take a look at the bass traps. With bass frequencies, they are less directional and they're much harder to control. If you remember the waveforms we were looking at earlier, the low end waveform has much more energy. It's much harder to absorb. It's much harder to predict how it will travel, as it takes longer to form, and it can collect around corners, travel down walls, up to ceilings, and then come back in completely random positions. So what you're looking to do there is you're looking to put down bass traps, such as corner traps or something like that, which are much thicker, have much more mass, which will absorb the energy. So if we take a look here at how bass frequencies travel, you can see that in this case, the direct sound is traveling to our listening position, and the bass frequencies are here bouncing off the corners, off the floor, all over the shop until we get to our mix position. And what this is going to do is it's going to cause problems such as maybe bass cancellation. So you will perhaps put more bass into your mix than you need, or it might be too much. It might give too much bass in the room, and you'll take too much bass out. So you want to try and treat these before they can travel around the room and become a problem. So here we've installed our bass traps, as you can see. These are, to give you an idea of the thickness, these are 30 centimeters thick. These are our Acoustic 30 bass traps, and they're made of a very dense foam, around about 30 kilograms, which is 30 kilograms of fiber compacted into the foam, which is just much more mass, which is able to absorb the larger waveforms that bass frequencies create. So as you see here now, the bass frequency that's reflecting off of the corners is getting absorbed before it's able to travel to our mix position, creating a much more uniform bass. We're only hearing the bass from the speakers, which is what we want, rather than the room amplifying frequencies that we don't want to hear. So now we've sort of brushed through what soundproofing is and what acoustic treatment is. We're going to look at some variations, as whilst these are all good sort of starting points, there are a lot of factors to consider. And the first one is you want to take a look at your room orientation. Before you even start to treat a room, you want to work out which is the best way to work. Ideally, you want to work long ways down a room. This is because you want to give your listening, recording, or mix position the best chance of frequencies naturally dissolving and dispersing before they're able to be reflected back at you. So if you were to work short ways down a room, you're effectively bringing the back wall much closer to you, which is allowing these waveforms to travel, bounce back much quicker, and cause many more problems than if you were working long ways down a room. Typically, you'd want to avoid small rooms, square rooms, as they will suffer this type of thing. You want a sort of irregular sort of shape. A rectangle works best. And the other key thing is to position yourself, whether it's with a microphone or your speakers or mix position. You want to position yourself in an equilateral triangle. In this case, with a mix position, you want even space between your speakers and your listening position, and you want it to be evenly spaced from the back of the wall. This is because we're trying to achieve the most uniform sound possible before we start with treatment. We want to be able to try and predict how the sound's going to travel, so that we've got our best chance of deciding where we're going to install our treatment. So as I said earlier, small and square box-like rooms, they are very difficult to treat, and if you can avoid them, do. This is because as the space is so small, sound is able to build up pressure and create resonances or overtones, which are sometimes called standing waves. And this can cause, a bit like the decoupling scenario, where a vibration can turn into a tone. A small space will allow sound to build up to create overtones. They're much harder to treat. You will need lots of different types of treatment for smaller spaces. So really what we're looking at with when you're looking to treat a room is the size of the room will dictate what type of treatment you require. A bigger room, you may just want to treat some early reflections. With a smaller room, if you want it completely dead for, say, a voiceover work, you will be looking at treating all the corners. You'll be looking at treating many more reflection points, trying to eliminate as much ambience as the room as possible. It really depends on what you're trying to achieve, which really leads us on to how much treatment do you need? And the answer is, it depends. If you're a drummer and you're looking for a nice ambient space, you may only need a few panels, say over the cymbals and to the sides, just to take care of some of the early reflections, you might want the ambience there. Likewise, if you're trying to get a very tight sort of vocal sound, things like vocal booths, stuff like that, you're going to treat all of the corners, you're going to treat all of the reflection points, and you're going to use different thicknesses depending on what you're using in your space as well. A bass guitar would need far more corner treatment and thicker absorption panels than, say, a voice or maybe a guitar or something like that. So what you'll find is a small space will initially sound boxy, a large space will sound very lively. You can choose between using absorption or diffusion to sort of decide how you want your space to sound. And another important thing before you look at treating your room is to try and find the optimum position in the room. Sometimes people call it the sweet spot. You might want to set up a set of speakers in your room and just have a walk around and move the speakers around, try and find the place where it sounds the best. And from there, that will dictate where you treat and how you treat your room. So if you found your optimum position, maybe try as a first step treating your first reflection points and corners and seeing how that sounds, and maybe add or take away in phases. The thing you want to avoid doing is caking your walls in foam or treatment from top to bottom without really considering what you're trying to achieve, because too much acoustic treatment can be just as bad as having none at all. It can decrease the size of your space, thus increasing the sound pressure of the space, create overtones, as we've said earlier, with smaller rooms. It can suck the life out of your recordings, or it can really affect, it depends on what you're doing, it can really affect things in different ways. So, and then finally, you can, as I said earlier, you can add diffusion or absorbers to taste if you want to add a bit of ambience to a room, or really just get a dry sound. So if we take a look now at just some pros and cons of acoustic treatment versus acoustic booths and different things that are available on the market, and what might be useful for your space. So the first thing to look at would be acoustic treatment can be tailored to your space. As we've seen, it's easy to identify your reflection points. It's easy to listen in a room and decide, do I want it to sound very dry? Do I want it to sound very ambient? Will I use some absorbers? Will I just stick with some diffusers on the back and first reflections? You can really tweak your space to make it work for you. A ready-made acoustic booth or other types of products, such as the Imperative Audio portable vocal booth, they are designed to take the guesswork out of it. So these will give you the optimum environment to recording, whether it's in your studio or you're taking a portable vocal booth down to your rehearsal room to maybe just record some demos, or taking it around your neighbor's house to record a podcast. It's going to give you the same results each time, as opposed to if you've built a studio, you're only going to get those results in your studio. Some other things to consider is your time frame for achieving treating your room. You can do quite a lot with very little. Just treating first reflection points, for instance, can go a long way to improving your mixes or your recordings. You can install acoustic treatment in phases, and sort of pick and choose what you're going to do and tweak it as you go along. With an acoustic booth, it's a larger investment, but it does give you an initial solution straight away, which is perfect for if you're a working musician or VO artist and you just need results quickly. The only thing I would say is in the case of a soundproofing or a soundproofing booth, as we've seen, you need lots of layers of acoustic absorbent material. Typically, if you're building this yourself, you're going to need to channel out the walls, install all of this treatment, plasterboard over the walls. Once you've done that, if you ever had to relocate, chances are you're not going to be able to take it with you. Whereas if you had a ready-made booth, such as like an Osmono booth, you can take those down. You can relocate your studio if you ever moved. So it sort of future-proofs your investment a little bit. But there's lots of different options for you. It's really identifying what you're trying to achieve, and then working towards that goal. So we also touch on room correction software. With room correction software, it's a good solution if you're limited to what you can install in a space. If you're in a small rented flat, or it's not an option to hang acoustic treatment on the walls, you may want to use a room correction software and digitally correct your mix position. This is more for mixing than recording, but it helps as a reference. It unfortunately doesn't replace a well-treated room, however, and this is because it works by analyzing your room. Essentially, you take a microphone and pop it in the mix position, and you play a test tone out of your speakers, and it will analyze your room and work out where there's dips in certain frequencies, where there's peaks in certain frequencies, and it will effectively EQ your room to give you a flat level, which is great. It works very well, but it unfortunately only works well in the position that you've sort of calibrated it in. If you start moving around your room, you will experience a less uniform sound, as the software's only really calibrated the correction for the position where you've originally done it. If you're a mix engineer and you have someone coming to take a listen and they're sitting sort of to the back of you, it will sound quite different to where you are. So that really is a brief sort of overview of everything that's available, and it's also a brief overview in what you can achieve with acoustics, how to find reflection points. It's quite a in-depth subject and there's a lot to cover, so I've tried to keep it fairly brief and simple. Of course, if you have any questions or anything, you're happy to answer some now, or you can email in. I'll bet it back to you, Dave.
Greg, thank you very much indeed. I've learned a few things there as well. So there's quite a few questions come through, but I will just say very quickly that if you do want to speak to Greg directly, you can do just by grabbing him on his email. And I believe Mike is going to put his email address in the chat room now, which you should be able to see. So that's Greg Niedzwiecki at Studiospares.com, but his email address is there. You can also get him through sales at Studiospares.com as well. So let's go to a few questions that have come in. Starting, are you okay, Greg? Can you talk after your marathon chat there?
It was a fast run through, but I've recovered enough.
Right. We've allowed him to have a drink, so I think he can start answering some questions now. So Mark Whitaker has asked, can you comment please on any considerations that would be given to use a loft room with sloping walls as a studio space?
Yeah, absolutely. A loft room, sloping walls in particular, can be very helpful. You want to have as many irregular surfaces as possible to break up the sound as it moves across the room. So the actual shape will work quite well. As discussed earlier, you want to work long ways ideally down it. And you can use the mirror technique to find these reflection points. You'll probably have a few on the slopes, a few on the walls to the left and right of you. But with the right treatment, that space can work very well.
I mean, and I suppose you're with that sloping roof, you're probably quite open to some bass issues as well. So it might be that you'd be looking at some bass traps.
Yeah, certainly
up in the V.
So some bass traps. Again, best thing to do is listen to your room first. Trust your ears. If it does sound too boomy, it's likely going to be in the corners. It may be that you need to treat all along where the sort of slope meets the wall. But there's lots of products available in different sizes and depths that can treat all these different areas very effectively.
Great. Joe DeCorpo asked as well about the mirror trick. Do you keep the mirror flat against the wall as you're moving it along?
Yes, you do. My animation skills, unfortunately, are not that good to make it seem that way. But yes, ideally, you have the mirror flat to the wall and about the level of where the speaker is, and you just move it along the wall until the person in your mix position can see the reflection of the mirror. That's the space that you're going to put your acoustic treatment.
Cool. Another fairly common question that's coming through is what thickness panel should we use for voiceover work, or should we use foam tiles?
Yeah, that's a good question. Generally speaking, you want to consider what the source you're recording sounds like. So in the case of a human voice, typically won't go down much below 100 hertz. So you're not going to need as thicker panels as, say, if you're treating a bass guitar. A 25 millimeter thick panel, such as these studio panels, as you can see, they're relatively slimline, and these are good to absorb that sort of frequency range, and maybe just a few bits of treatment here or there in the corners, just in case you're getting sound traveling and bouncing around, creating a room mode which is amplifying a bass frequency that's not in your voice.
I mean, in fairness, these Studio ATK kits that we spoke about earlier, there's a lot of voiceover artists using these kits anyway. Is that true?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm on the phone to many voiceover artists, tell them the same thing that's in the presentation, treat some first reflection points. If you use these over the foam tiles, it's a much more denser material, so it absorbs on different levels. The foam tiles tend to not work so well because they're less dense, and whilst they have the sort of egg carton shape to diffuse some of the frequencies, they're not really absorbing them as well as fiberglass panels.
So are egg cups or egg boxes as good as duvets?
Well, the jury's still out, but I'm going to go out on a whim and say no.
All right, then, fair enough. Just going back to those panels as well. Again, we've been asked about this. Is this how do we fix them? Is it with the impaler, or can you just stick them flat to the wall using like a Velcro or something?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I would suggest using an impaler clip. I think I have one here. Don't know if you can see that.
Yep.
The reason you would want to use something like this, if you stick them straight to the wall, you're losing some of the effectiveness of the panel as it's stuck to a surface. So it's going to absorb some frequencies, but it may transfer some others to your wall. By using an impaler clip, you're effectively spiking the panel. I don't know if you can see here. You're spiking the panel onto the clip, and it's creating a small air gap, which will help diffuse any frequencies that do make it through the panel.
Cool. There's a couple of quick fire ones here as well. Mitchell Humphreys asks, ideally, should you avoid parallel walls?
Yes, ideally you want to work in a sort of shoebox style shape or in a regular shape with as least amount of corners as possible. But if you're working along parallel walls in a short space, the reflections are going to bounce around and build up far quicker than a longer irregular space.
Cool. There's a couple of others here. We might get all through as many as we can. Francesco asks, any advice on ways to seal studio doors, please?
Yeah, that's a good question. Way you would do it would be very similar to if you imagine you're trying to make something water or airtight. If water or air could get in, sound could get in. So using something like a neoprene strip or some rubber stripping, draft excluders, things like that. We actually sell expanding tape, which you can put around the door frame, and it will create a seal. So when you shut the door, there is no air gap. There's no way for sound to penetrate through.
I mean, ultimately, I suppose it's down to the depth of the door and all sorts of different things.
There is that to consider as well. You might want to put some treatment on the door, or a lot of soundproof spaces have an airlock where you have an outer door and an inner door, which helps to trap any sound, and it effectively loses its energy before it can escape through that air gap. But
again, I suppose that's whether it's a case of treatments or soundproofing. So obviously two different
exactly
things.
Right, yeah.
Francine Brody asks, would you recommend a portable acoustic blanket booth while waiting for the real thing? That's and she then adds, that's for voiceovers. I mean, I might just take this one for a second, if I may, Greg.
Yeah, sure.
Those things can help. There is no two ways about it. And there are various little tricks that you could do to help you in that situation. Ultimately, I mean, if you are a professional and you're trying to make money from your art, then unfortunately there needs to be some investment. So things like the portable vocal booth, which is sitting right behind Greg there. In fact, I wonder if I can get Greg to stand up and just go and walk in there, just so you get a sense of how large or how small that is. Something like the portable vocal booth is, and that's actually collapsible, so that works really, really well for voiceover artists. And in fact, we've sold lots to voiceover artists. Yes, it's just over the £1,000 mark, but you can buy them on through on credit through us as well. So it doesn't have to be as expensive as a full booth, which can cost you £4,000 or £5,000 upwards. So meanwhile, I suppose you could use various tricks like the blanket booth, and isocubes are another good idea, which is a small round acoustic foam, if you like, that goes over the microphone. That can have some effect, although that can affect the sound of the mic as well. Is that fair, Greg?
Yeah, absolutely. It all helps. It's just down to how it will affect. So in the case of the isocube, it's great because you pop it over the mic and it eliminates a good 80% of the reflections, but it creates a proximity effect where internally sound pressure is building up and enhancing bass sound. So you might have a great sounding microphone that ends up sounding a little bit more bassy than it would because of the enclosed space. But likewise, if that's all you can use, it's better than having an untreated room.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and same with acoustic. We've all started out with a duvet hanging behind us and a reflection filter, and got results of some form or another.
That's true. Just I still have a couple more here, if that's right, Greg. So Kenny Belcher asks, it says your 80K panels are 25 mil, but he's read in a number of publications that absorbers should be a minimum of 100 mil. Is this an older assumption? And before you get into this, all these things are down to application. It just depends on what you're doing. It depends on your room. It depends on the size of the room. It depends if you've got a drum kit in there or you're doing a voiceover. But I'll let you answer that in full.
No, that's absolutely right. It's down to the frequencies you're trying to absorb. So in the case of a voiceover or maybe a space where you're recording guitars, 25 millimeters going to be sufficient for the frequencies that they generate. Like you say, if you're looking at mixing very bass heavy music or having a drum kit in there, you're going to want a different thickness because mass equals absorption, essentially. So the lower the frequency, the thicker you need your treatment. Or you can use a combination of the two. It really depends on how you're laying out your room and what it sounds like ultimately. Always listen to your room.
I mean, a good point on that one, Kenny, is just to contact Greg directly here, and you can have a more in-depth conversation about that. I'm sure Greg will be up for talking to you about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So here's a really good question, actually, from Marcus Lancaster. He says, I've noticed that many bass traps claim to treat frequencies down to 40 hertz, but what happens to the sub-frequencies below this? Oh, good question.
That's may have almost stumped me on it. Yes, bass traps, particularly very thick ones, will treat down to 40 hertz. Usually what happens is there'll be an air gap behind your bass trap where, as the sound is absorbed and passes through your bass trap, the energy is weakened, and typically it will vibrate in your wall but dissipate before it becomes a problem. But you can use things like decoupling methods to help reduce that. So getting your speakers up on some absorption pads, things like that, placing your sub in a position where you're not going to get those low frequencies passing through. It can all help, but it can be tough. It can be tough to control those low end frequencies for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I've worked in studios where subs have been in place, and usually that has meant a floating floor, to be quite honest, which obviously refers back to your decoupling advice earlier. Right, so Maria Wallace, hi Maria. She says hi Greg and Dave.
Oh, yes,
that's very nice. Maria's in East London, and she says, could you please clear up some confusion for me around diffusion? Is this effective in small places? As I've been told, it only becomes effective in spaces more than 3 meters. Is this correct?
Yes and no. Diffusion can help to add, as I say, some ambience to a smaller space. But the problem is as a smaller space is able to build up sound pressure quickly, all of those mini waveforms that we saw in the animation, you have a better chance of them bouncing around and basically becoming a different waveform in a smaller space. In a larger space, it will diffuse them out and they will disappear before they get back to your mix position. You could use a combination of the two. You could use a diffuser and an absorber. So you diffuse a frequency to add a bit of life, but you put some spot treatment in key areas to absorb these scatter reflections before they become a problem.
Yeah, Maria, I suggest that you speak to Greg directly. I think that could be a bit more of a conversation, and hopefully if he has a bit more of an idea about your room, then he might be able to be a little bit more precise about the solution. I definitely want to read the next one. This is Martin Little, a fellow bass player by the looks of it. So as a bassist, primarily, I need to produce strong and accurate low end. What would be a maximum bass driver size recommendation in a 3 by 4 meter room with getting into bass traps? Before we go any further, I'd just like to say all bass rigs should have at least 2 15-inch cabs, 8 12-inch drivers, and a couple of 10s on there as well. Is that fair?
I was going to say 2 21-inch, but yeah.
Anyway, sorry. Yeah, are you able to answer that?
I would need to do a bit of research, just look back at some notes, but it's essentially you want to pick a driver size suitable for the size of the room. So we joke, but it's no use having a 18-inch driver in a 2 by 2 meter space. It's just going to fill up the space with bass, and you're just never going to treat it. If you want to email in or call in, absolutely, I'll look into it and answer the question for you.
Martin, I'd also just add there, as a bassist too, I tend to use 10-inch drivers these days. So I use a Mark Bass Twin 10 setup, although I have two sets of those. But when recording, I only use the one Twin 10. And I have to be honest, it's been pretty precise and without too much boominess, if you like, in most rooms that I've worked in. So they're incredibly powerful, but it's not all sub. It's good directional throw from the bass end. So I personally find 10s a good solution for those sort of situations. But again, yes, speak to Greg directly and maybe he can look into it a bit more for you. I have here, Chad Mason. Hey, Chad. Would decoupling a drum kit from the floor in an attic help with soundproofing, even if the walls are not treated?
To a very small degree, yes. But you're going to stop maybe the kick drum being so prominent from the the floor downstairs, but generally you're going to need to treat the walls as well. You're going to need to decouple the walls from the floor and put absorption in place to really attenuate those frequencies down to an acceptable level if it's a residential area.
Yeah, that's a difficult one. I don't think I've ever seen any solution for drums other than an enclosed one, quite honestly, which is a genuine booth like the Esmono behind us. But of course, often they're too big and heavy and dense to put in an attic. It would just probably fall through, to be fair. Alex, is that Christaki or Christaki? I have seen tunable tubes being used for bass traps. Are these still current or just the foam ones you mentioned?
No, tubes can work well. I'm not so up on those as acoustic treatment, so I'd certainly have to do a bit of research for you there. But I have seen them used in studios I've worked in before, and they can work well. They sort of, as I understand it, use airflow to attenuate and attune the frequencies into areas that can then be absorbed by other materials.
Great. John McHugh, I read that it's more important to treat the position behind the singer than in front, as with the vocal booth you showed. Is this true? Thanks.
Yes, it's quite important to treat behind if you're not using a booth. So if you're just in a room and you're singing down the long ways of a room, a sound can bounce back behind you and come into what you're singing into, the microphone. By putting a layer of absorption there, it's going to stop any long reflections coming back into your microphone. In the case of something like the PVB behind me, that works slightly different, as you're absorbing all of the reflections and attenuating the sound pressure levels all inside the booth before it can even escape and reflect. So it's a different animal here than if you're in a plain room. Absolutely use some reflection behind you to stop long reflections. And
also with the PVB, its cylindrical shape helps avoid those standing waves.
And precisely, there's no corners. It's all treated. It's a completely different animal.
Okay, there's Martin's back. Agree on the bass cabs, 10-inch all the way. Good man.
Yeah, waiting for you, Dave.
But apparently he was talking about studio mix monitors. My apologies, Martin. I do apologize. So he's suggesting A7Xs. Yeah, they're quite big. I can't remember what size room you said. I think you said 3x4, if I remember correctly. I mean, they're quite big for an area like that, really. Personally, well, then I would be talking 6-inch drivers. I use Sonodyne. They're 5.5-inch drivers, and they carry a lot of weight, I have to say. So personally, especially where monitoring was concerned, in that size room, I would probably go for a 5 to 6-inch driver, because you can still give them a bit of volume, and they will still sound fairly precise. If the bigger they are, you're going to lose. You're very, very quickly going to lose any sort of precision within the throw, because you're just going to get boom reflections and everything. So I would say 5-6-inch personally. What about you, Greg? Would you agree with that?
No, hit nail on the head. Absolutely agree.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think we're sort of there. Am I missing any, Mike? Can you tell me? I would hate to miss any. I think there was one here as well, from Simon Rose, actually. Sorry, Simon. I think I missed you initially. But it says, thanks for advice. COVID forced me to work from home broadcasting radio show from spare room. Used pillows, etc. Initially to make it listenable, which is, you got to try it out somehow. Now setting up properly, I have 9 acoustic panels spread evenly, which has deadened the room nicely, but sounds boomy. Do I need bass traps too? Using the room mainly for voiceover, I have not had audio rejected, but I feel I could sound better. Room is rectangular, single bedroom size. So yeah, I suppose it depends on the size, the depth of the panels, and also the positioning, I would guess.
Yeah, but it does sound like perhaps maybe some frequencies are collecting in corners and turning into another frequency, creating a overtone within the room or room mode. So try it out. Use your pillows, put some in the corners, see if you can hear a difference. If you can, maybe some bass traps are the way to go. It's hard to sort of advise if you're not in the room, but if you have absorbent materials to hand, to at least try something out, and if you can hear a difference, that will give you a good idea of whether you need to invest in something a bit more up to the task, like a bass trap, or if you don't hear much of a difference at all, it could be, as you say, the thickness of the panel, sort of positioning of them.
Yeah, I would suggest actually probably, Simon, that this is worth you giving Greg a call directly on. So you can either call the office, or if you email him using the, I think his address is now in the chat room. So just email Greg directly, and I'm sure you can get into it a bit deeper and take it from there. So there's been some great questions. I think we're sort of through them now. I'm conscious of the time, so I'll just go through these two questions here. What does it say here? So this is George Ivanov, who asks, how would you deal with a situation where you can't have acoustic treatment and you have to keep moving to different rooms and have to use studio monitors? Oh, right. So this is an absolute portability issue. So that's moving from room to room. So,
well, that's
there's a good question. It depends on the rooms you go into, etc., etc. But stands help, and like the ice acoustics and pads and so forth. But
yeah, absolutely. Sorry, Greg. There's as you say, simple techniques to just improve the immediate area. If you can get your speakers up on stands, this might be a perfect example of where room correction software may be useful to you. If you're moving around lots of different rooms and it's just going to be you in a mixed position, absolutely you could calibrate each space before you mix, and that will go some way to helping you achieve a uniform sound in each room. How effective it will be will depend on the room and how well you calibrate it, but that would probably be the best solution I can think of off the top of my head.
Great. I'm conscious of the time, but I'm just going to ask one more question here, and then we'll get into our big giveaway, and I'll tell you about the deal that we're offering everybody as well. So Joe DeCorpo asks, is it possible to send the room layout and size, etc., and you can advise me on the driver size for my desk and any sound treatments, etc.? Well, the simple answer is to that, Joe, is yes, that's what we're here for. You've got Greg's email there in the chat room. Just go to Greg directly, or again, you can go to sales@studiospares.com, and Greg or one of the guys will pick up your mail, and we'll make sure that we absolutely look after you, as we will anybody on this call that wants further help and advice. So we've now got to the magic 8 o'clock. So first things first, listen, thank you so much, because virtually everybody is still on the call, which is just wonderful. And I hope it's been useful to you. This is I think we would like to do every month, and we'll have a different subject every month. I can't quite reveal what's going on in July, but it's pretty exciting. So we will, of course, let you know through our eShot. But I think it's time, Mike, I've got my lovely assistant over here, to pick somebody to win the Studiospares Studio Panel ATK24. Now, you can only win this if you're still here. So he may pull out the name and find we're not here. So it's really important that if you're still in the room, because we can't see everybody directly, either to put your hand up, raise your hand, or jump into the Q&A or chat room very quickly to let us know you're here. So basically, everybody was assigned a number when they registered, and so we're just going to do a random number pick from our friends at Google, and Mike is going to tell me who the winner is. So I'm just hoping that you're in the room now. So what do we got then, Mike?
54.
Number 54. Who's this? I would say drum roll, but it'd probably be too loud. Steve Kendrick. So is Steve Kendrick still with us? Is he in the room? Steve, are you with us? I'll give you a moment. It's not looking good. I think what might be a quicker way is to do it from the number within the participants. Let's do it. Let's do it that way.
He's still here, just wait.
Oh, he's here. Are you? Steve, sorry, I nearly ran it again. So congratulations, Steve. I think we have your email. So Mike will contact you tomorrow and get your full details, and we'll send you the color of your choice, by the way, of the Studio ATK 24 kit. But you could all still be a winner, as they say, because what we're going to do is offer everybody that's still on the call a 20% discount on any of our Studio ATK kits. And I believe Mike is just going to put a link in there for you now. And he's also going to put in a very special code, which you use at checkout, and that will give you 20% off of any of our kits, other than Steve, who's just won one. So that's fine. Yeah, that's nice, isn't it? So please take advantage of this deal. It's available till Saturday midnight. Is that correct? And if you have any questions about it and you still need help and deciding which one you want or which color, then again, you can contact Greg directly or any of the team here at Studiospares, and we'll be more than happy to help you and advise you on which kit you can go for. But remember, that's 20% off until Saturday night. So you need to jump in there fairly quick to get it. We'll also send, I've just been told, I've just been given that. We'll also send a little email out tomorrow to everybody just to remind you of the deal and the code that you can use on the site. So once again, thank you so much for coming along. We really appreciate it. And thanks to Greg for giving us such a great presentation. Greg is there to be used and abused as well, I suspect. So wow. by all means, just send him an email and on any acoustic questions you have, and I'm sure Greg will be really happy to help. So from Greg, Rob, Mike and myself, we'd just like to thank you very much for being here, and hopefully you can join us next month on our next Talkback session. Good night. Have a good week.